The German torpedo struck at 0347 hours, tearing through the hull of USS Liberty Bell like a white-hot knife through butter, and Chief Petty Officer Jack "Torch" McKenna felt the deck buckle beneath his feet as seawater began flooding the engine compartment where he'd been welding emergency hull repairs. Blood was already streaming down his face from flying shrapnel, his left arm hung useless from a dislocated shoulder, and the ship's emergency klaxon was screaming that they had maybe 45 minutes before the Liberty Bell would slip beneath the freezing waters of the North Atlantic with 300 American soldiers trapped below decks. But Jack couldn't think about dying. Not when his twin brother Tommy was aboard the destroyer USS Franklin, racing through submarine-infested waters to reach them. Not when Tommy's ship would arrive just in time to watch 300 men drown if Jack couldn't keep the Liberty Bell afloat long enough for rescue. Not when the only thing standing between those soldiers and a watery grave was Jack's ability to weld underwater emergency patches with a damaged welding rig, one good arm, and 43 minutes of air left in the ship's emergency compartments. What happened next would defy every principle of marine engineering, push the limits of human endurance beyond breaking point, and prove that sometimes love for your brother can make you attempt the impossible when failure means watching everyone you're sworn to protect die in front of your eyes. If stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button. These accounts show what one person can accomplish when everything they care about is on the line and giving up means losing everyone. The explosion that changed everything came without warning at 0347 hours on December 23, 1943, when U-boat 437 fired 2 torpedoes at the American transport vessel USS Liberty Bell as she struggled through heavy seas 200 miles southeast of Iceland. The first torpedo missed by 20 yards, creating a waterspout that drenched the port side with freezing spray. But the second torpedo struck directly amidships with the force of 10,000 pounds of TNT, blowing a hole 15 feet wide through the starboard hull and sending a shockwave that cracked bulkheads throughout the ship. The impact threw men from their bunks, shattered pipes and electrical systems, and created a sound like the world ending, a deep, metallic scream followed by the terrifying rush of thousands of gallons of ice-cold seawater pouring into the engine compartment. Emergency lighting failed instantly, plunging most of the ship into darkness broken only by sparks from severed electrical cables and the orange glow of small fires igniting throughout the damaged sections. Chief Petty Officer Jack McKenna had been working the midnight watch in the engine room, using his welding torch to repair stress fractures in the hull plating that had developed during 3 days of heavy weather. The Liberty Bell was an old converted merchant vessel that had been pressed into military service to transport troops and supplies across the Atlantic, and her aging hull was showing the strain of wartime operations under extreme conditions. The ship had been retrofitted hastily in 1942, with passenger accommodations converted to troop quarters that now housed 300 American soldiers being transported to reinforce Allied positions in North Africa. The conversion had been done quickly and cheaply, with minimal attention to compartmentalization and damage control systems that might be needed if the ship came under enemy attack. Jack had been concerned about the hull integrity for weeks, noting stress fractures and metal fatigue that indicated the old merchant vessel wasn't designed for the punishment she was taking in the North Atlantic winter storms. He'd been working overtime shifts, welding reinforcements and patches to keep the ship seaworthy, but the torpedo blast had just rendered all his careful work meaningless in a single, devastating instant. When the torpedo hit, Jack was thrown against a steam pipe with enough force to dislocate his left shoulder and tear a jagged gash across his forehead where flying metal debris had nearly taken his eye. The impact knocked him unconscious for nearly 30 seconds, and when he came to, the engine compartment was flooding rapidly and the ship was already listing hard to starboard. Jack struggled to his feet, fighting waves of pain from his injured shoulder and the blood that was streaming into his eyes from the head wound. The emergency lighting had failed, leaving only the dim glow from his welding equipment to illuminate the chaos around him. Seawater was pouring through the torpedo hole like a waterfall, and Jack could hear the terrified screams of 300 soldiers who were trapped in the lower compartments as the ship began to sink. But the worst part was the radio message crackling through the damaged communication system. Liberty Bell, this is USS Franklin. We are en route to your position. Estimated arrival time 45 minutes. Prepare for emergency evacuation. Tommy's voice. Jack's twin brother was the chief radioman aboard the destroyer USS Franklin, and he was racing through U-boat-infested waters to reach them. But Jack knew something Tommy didn't: the Liberty Bell wouldn't last 45 minutes. The torpedo hole was too big, the flooding too severe, and the old ship's compartmentalization too weak to prevent total hull failure. Jack had maybe 30 minutes before the Liberty Bell rolled over and sank, taking 300 American soldiers and his own hope of ever seeing Tommy again straight to the bottom of the North Atlantic. The desperate plan that defied physics. Jack's plan was insane by any reasonable standard of marine engineering. He was going to attempt underwater welding repairs on a torpedo hole while the ship was actively sinking, using damaged equipment with one functional arm, in water temperature that would kill him from hypothermia within 15 minutes of full immersion. Underwater welding was dangerous under the best conditions. Attempting it on a sinking ship with battle damage and jury-rigged equipment was essentially suicide. But Jack had grown up with Tommy in the shipyards of Norfolk, Virginia, where their father William McKenna had taught both boys that sometimes impossible situations required impossible solutions. William McKenna had been a master welder at Norfolk Naval Shipyard for 23 years before a crane accident crushed both his legs and ended his career. The accident happened when Jack and Tommy were 15, old enough to understand that their father's disability meant the family would struggle financially but young enough to still need guidance about how to survive in a world that didn't care about working-class families. William had raised the boys alone after their mother died of tuberculosis when they were 12, working double shifts at the shipyard to pay for rent and food while teaching Jack and Tommy everything he knew about metalwork, ship construction, and the unbreakable bonds that held families together through hard times. When everything's going to hell, William had told them every night after dinner, sitting in the wheelchair that had become his permanent companion, you don't worry about the rules. You worry about getting the job done and getting everyone home safe. The bosses got their regulations and their safety manuals, but when lives are on the line, you do whatever it takes to save people. That's what makes you a man. The McKenna boys had lived by that philosophy through their childhood, protecting each other from neighborhood bullies, sharing what little money they could earn from odd jobs, and dreaming about serving their country on the great ships their father had helped build. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, both brothers enlisted on the same day, determined to serve together and watch each other's backs in whatever battles lay ahead. Jack's first challenge was getting his welding equipment operational after the torpedo blast had damaged the power systems and electrical connections. The main welding generator had been thrown off its mounts by the explosion and was partially flooded, but Jack managed to get it running by bypassing the damaged circuits and rerouting power through emergency cables that he spliced together with techniques his father had taught him for emergency shipyard repairs. The underwater welding helmet had been cracked by flying debris, but Jack sealed the crack with emergency putty and hoped it would hold long enough to complete the repairs. The air hose had been severed in 3 places, but Jack spliced it back together using metal clamps and rubber gaskets salvaged from damaged machinery. Most critically, Jack had to create emergency steel patches for the torpedo hole using whatever metal he could find in the flooded engine compartment. He cut sections from damaged hull plating, steam pipes, and even the ship's galley equipment, hammering them into roughly the right shape with tools that were designed for precision work, not emergency construction. As Jack worked frantically to prepare his equipment, the ship continued to list further to starboard and the water level in the engine compartment rose higher. Every few minutes, Jack had to stop his welding preparations to help soldiers who had been trapped in flooded compartments and were fighting their way to higher decks. "Chief, how long we got?" asked Corporal Mike Santos, a 19-year-old from Brooklyn who was helping Jack carry welding equipment through knee-deep water. Jack looked at the rising water level and calculated the rate of flooding in his head. "Maybe 25 minutes before she goes under, kid. Maybe less if the hull plating starts buckling from the strain." Santos stared at Jack with wide eyes. "And you're going to weld underwater?" "Chief, that's suicide." "No, kid," Jack replied, testing the air pressure in his damaged welding helmet. "Suicide is doing nothing and watching 300 men drown when my brother's ship gets here. This is just really, really dangerous. The descent into freezing hell. At 0358 hours, with the ship listing 15 degrees to starboard and the water level rising by 2 feet every minute, Jack entered the flooded engine compartment wearing his patched welding helmet and carrying 150 pounds of welding equipment through water that was so cold it felt like liquid fire against his skin. The temperature of the North Atlantic in December was 34 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause unconsciousness within 15 minutes and death within 30 minutes for anyone fully immersed. Jack's makeshift wetsuit, cobbled together from emergency gear and canvas tarpaulins, would provide some protection, but not much. He could already feel the cold seeping through the improvised material as he waded deeper into the flooded compartment. The underwater welding process required Jack to work in complete darkness except for the brilliant arc of his welding torch, which created a bubble of superheated gas around the work area but also made it impossible to see more than a few inches in any direction. The contrast between the blazing heat of the welding arc and the ice-cold water surrounding him created a sensory nightmare that made concentration nearly impossible. Jack had to navigate by feel, finding the edges of the torpedo hole with his hands while trying to position steel patches that weighed over 100 pounds each. The metal was slippery from seawater and oil, and Jack's injured shoulder made it agony to lift and maneuver the heavy steel plates into position against the water pressure that was trying to force them away from the hull. The first patch attempt failed when the steel buckled under the water pressure and tore away from the hull, nearly taking Jack's welding torch with it. The second attempt failed when Jack's air hose became tangled in wreckage from the torpedo blast and nearly strangled him before he could cut himself free with an emergency knife. The third attempt failed when a power surge in the damaged electrical system caused his welding torch to short out, leaving him in complete darkness 15 feet underwater with rapidly depleting air supplies. Each failure cost precious time and brought the ship closer to total structural collapse. Jack could feel the hull plating shifting and groaning around him as the Liberty Bell's aging framework struggled to handle the stress of progressive flooding and battle damage. The ship was literally coming apart at the seams, and Jack was running out of time, equipment, and physical strength to hold her together. But Jack kept trying, because every minute he delayed was a minute closer to Tommy arriving just in time to watch the Liberty Bell disappear beneath the waves. Each time Jack surfaced for more equipment or to clear water from his helmet, he could see the ship listing further and hear the increasingly desperate voices of soldiers who were running out of places to retreat as the flooding continued to spread through the damaged vessel. The water was now reaching the main deck, and soldiers were being forced to crowd into the upper superstructure as their berthing areas and mess halls became uninhabitable. Some of the men were already showing signs of panic, talking about abandoning ship and taking their chances in the frigid Atlantic rather than waiting for a rescue that might never come. "Chief, the water's up to the main deck now," Corporal Santos called out as Jack prepared for his fourth descent. "Some of the guys are talking about jumping overboard and taking their chances in the water." "Tell them to wait," Jack shouted back, his voice hoarse from inhaling welding fumes and seawater. "Tell them my brother's coming, and I'm going to keep this ship afloat until he gets here." But privately, Jack was beginning to doubt whether his plan would work. The torpedo hole was larger than he'd initially thought, the steel patches were barely holding against the water pressure, and his welding equipment was failing faster than he could repair it. Worse, he was beginning to show signs of hypothermia. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his welding torch, and his speech was becoming slurred from cold exposure. The moment when everything went wrong. At 0411 hours, with Jack 15 feet underwater attempting to weld his fifth emergency patch into place, disaster struck in the form of a secondary explosion that rocked the ship and nearly killed him instantly. The explosion was caused by seawater reaching the ship's auxiliary boiler, creating a steam blast that blew out several hull plates and sent a shockwave through the flooded compartments that slammed Jack against the ship's keel with enough force to crack 2 ribs and nearly knock him unconscious. But the real disaster was that the explosion damaged Jack's air hose, cutting his air supply down to maybe 5 minutes of breathing gas. He was trapped underwater, his welding equipment was scattered by the blast, and the emergency patches he'd already installed were being torn away by the increased water flow from the new hull breaches. Jack had 2 choices: surface immediately and probably watch the ship sink before he could return with repaired equipment, or continue working underwater with 5 minutes of air and hope he could complete enough welding to keep the ship afloat until Tommy arrived. Jack chose to keep working. Using the last of his air supply, Jack managed to position one final steel patch over the largest section of the torpedo hole and began welding it into place with a torch that was sputtering and failing from water damage. His vision was going black from lack of oxygen, his injured ribs made every movement agony, and he could feel the cold water beginning to seep through his damaged wetsuit. But he kept welding, because through the hull plating he could hear the voices of 300 soldiers who were counting on him to keep them alive long enough for rescue to arrive. He kept welding because Tommy's voice was still crackling over the radio, reporting that the USS Franklin was 20 minutes out and closing fast. He kept welding because their father had taught them never to give up on people who were depending on you. At 0416 hours, with his air supply completely exhausted and his consciousness fading from oxygen deprivation, Jack completed the final weld that sealed the emergency patch into place. The patch wasn't perfect, it was leaking around the edges and wouldn't hold indefinitely, but it was enough to slow the flooding and buy the Liberty Bell the extra time she needed. Jack clawed his way to the surface through 15 feet of ice-cold water, his lungs burning from lack of oxygen and his body shutting down from hypothermia and exhaustion. When he finally broke the surface, gasping and choking on seawater, Corporal Santos and 2 other soldiers dragged him out of the flooded compartment and began emergency first aid. "Chief, the ship's not listing anymore," Santos said, his voice filled with amazement and relief. "I think your patch is working." The water level stopped rising. Jack could barely speak through his chattering teeth and damaged throat, but he managed to croak out a single question. How much time?" Santos checked his watch. 22 minutes until the Franklin gets here, Chief. I think we're going to make it." The rescue that justified everything. At 0429 hours, the destroyer USS Franklin appeared on the horizon like a gray ghost cutting through the heavy seas, her bow throwing spray high into the air as she raced at maximum speed to reach the sinking Liberty Bell. Jack had been pulled to the upper deck where Navy corpsmen were treating him for hypothermia, blood loss, and possible internal injuries from his damaged ribs. But Jack refused to be evacuated until he knew the ship was safe. His emergency patches were holding for now, but they were temporary repairs that could fail at any moment under the relentless pressure of the incoming seawater. The Liberty Bell was still in mortal danger, and 300 soldiers were still depending on the welding work he'd done 15 feet underwater with one good arm and no air supply. The Franklin's approach was a masterpiece of seamanship under impossible conditions. Captain William "Bull" Morrison had to bring his destroyer alongside the listing transport vessel in heavy seas while both ships were rolling unpredictably in the storm. One miscalculation could result in a collision that would sink both vessels and kill everyone aboard. "Liberty Bell, this is USS Franklin," came Tommy's voice over the radio, professional but strained with emotion that he was fighting to keep under control. "We are alongside and ready to begin emergency evacuation. Prepare to transfer wounded personnel first." Jack struggled to his feet despite the protests of the medical team and made his way to the radio equipment on unsteady legs. His voice was barely a whisper from the damage to his throat caused by inhaling seawater and welding fumes, but he managed to key the microphone and respond to his brother. "Franklin, this is Jack McKenna aboard Liberty Bell. Tommy, I've got emergency patches holding the torpedo hole, but they won't last much longer. You need to get these soldiers off now. I'm reading structural stress throughout the hull, she could break apart at any moment." There was a pause before Tommy's voice came back, filled with emotion that professional training couldn't completely suppress. "Jack? Jesus Christ, Jack, we thought you were dead when we saw the torpedo hit. The whole ship's listing and there's steam coming from multiple compartments. I'm alive, Tommy, but I don't know for how long. The patches I welded are barely holding against the water pressure. You've got maybe 20 minutes before this ship either sinks or breaks in half. Start with the wounded and work your way down. And Tommy, if something happens to me, tell Dad I kept the promise." The evacuation of 300 soldiers from a damaged ship to a destroyer in heavy seas was normally a process that would take hours under ideal conditions. But the Liberty Bell didn't have hours. Jack's emergency welding was already showing signs of failure as the steel patches began to buckle and warp under the relentless assault of the North Atlantic. Tommy coordinated the evacuation from the Franklin's bridge while Jack directed rescue operations from the Liberty Bell's deck, despite his injuries and exhaustion that made it difficult to stand upright. Soldiers were transferred by rope and pulley systems rigged between the two ships, with the most severely wounded going first and the able-bodied helping to carry equipment and assist with the dangerous transfer operation. The process was terrifying and dangerous. Each soldier had to jump across several feet of churning ocean water while both ships rolled unpredictably in the heavy seas. Timing was critical. A mistimed jump could result in a man being crushed between the two hulls or lost in the freezing water where survival time was measured in minutes. At 0441 hours, Jack heard the sound he'd been dreading. The metallic screech of his emergency patches beginning to tear away from the hull under stress that had finally exceeded their structural limits. The ship immediately began listing more severely as water poured through the failing repairs, and Jack could hear the groaning sound of metal under stress that indicated the Liberty Bell's hull was approaching catastrophic failure. "Tommy, the patches are going," Jack radioed to his brother. "How many men do we still have aboard?" 47 soldiers plus your damage control team," Tommy replied. "We need at least 10 more minutes." Jack looked at his failing welding equipment and made a decision that would either save the remaining men or kill him in the attempt. "I'm going back down to reinforce the patches. Keep the evacuation going." "Jack, no." Tommy's voice cracked over the radio. "You've done enough. You're injured and hypothermic. Let someone else handle it." "There is no one else, Tommy," Jack replied, already putting his damaged welding helmet back on. "I'm the only one who knows how these patches are positioned. I'm going back down." The final descent that saved everyone. Jack's final underwater welding attempt was performed under conditions that would have been considered impossible even for a healthy, fully equipped diver with proper support equipment. He was suffering from hypothermia that made his hands shake uncontrollably, blood loss that left him dizzy and weak, and possible internal injuries that caused shooting pains through his chest with every movement. His welding equipment was damaged and jury-rigged with spare parts that weren't designed to work together. The water was colder than when he'd started, and his makeshift wetsuit was torn and flooding, providing almost no protection against the killing cold of the North Atlantic. But Jack descended into the flooded engine compartment one last time because 47 soldiers and his own damage control team were still aboard the Liberty Bell, and Tommy's ship was running out of time to complete the evacuation before the old transport vessel broke apart or rolled over completely. The descent was a nightmare of pain, cold, and mechanical failure. Jack's welding torch kept cutting out due to water infiltration in the electrical system. His air hose had been patched so many times that it leaked constantly, forcing him to work in short bursts before surfacing to clear water from his helmet. The steel patches he was trying to install kept slipping from his numb fingers, and several times he nearly lost consciousness from oxygen deprivation and hypothermia. Working by feel in complete darkness except for the intermittent glow of his welding arc, Jack managed to reinforce 2 of his failing patches with additional steel plating and new welding that created watertight seals strong enough to withstand the increasing water pressure. The work took 14 minutes, longer than anyone can survive underwater in North Atlantic conditions without proper thermal protection and unlimited air supply, but Jack completed the repairs through sheer determination and the knowledge that failure meant watching his brother arrive just in time to witness a mass drowning. When Jack was pulled from the water for the final time, he was unconscious from hypothermia and oxygen deprivation. His core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, his pulse was weak and irregular, and he had to be revived by Navy corpsmen using emergency heating procedures and artificial respiration. For several terrifying minutes, the medical team thought they had lost him. But Jack's welding had bought the Liberty Bell the extra time she needed for complete evacuation. His reinforced patches held against the water pressure just long enough for the last soldiers to be transferred to safety aboard the Franklin. At 0458 hours, the last soldier was transferred from the Liberty Bell to the USS Franklin. Jack was among the final personnel to leave the ship, and only after he'd personally verified that no one remained aboard the damaged vessel. He had to be carried to the transfer point on a stretcher, semi-conscious and shivering uncontrollably from hypothermia, but alert enough to insist on doing a final head count to ensure every man was accounted for. 5 minutes after the evacuation was completed, Jack's emergency patches finally failed completely under the accumulated stress of water pressure and structural damage. The Liberty Bell rolled over and sank stern first into the North Atlantic, her hull breaking apart as she went down. But by then, all 300 soldiers and the entire crew were safely aboard the Franklin, alive because one bleeding welder had refused to give up on them when conventional wisdom said the situation was hopeless. The sight of the Liberty Bell disappearing beneath the waves was both heartbreaking and triumphant. Jack watched from the Franklin's deck, wrapped in blankets and receiving medical treatment, as the ship he'd fought so hard to save finally succumbed to her injuries. But there was no sadness in the moment, only pride in knowing that every life had been saved and every man was going home to his family. Tommy met Jack as he was carried aboard the Franklin on a stretcher. Both brothers were crying, from relief, from exhaustion, from the knowledge that they'd just lived through something that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. "You crazy bastard," Tommy whispered, gripping Jack's hand. "You actually did it. You saved them all." Jack could barely speak through his damaged throat and chattering teeth, but he managed to whisper back, "Had to. Couldn't let you come all this way just to watch us drown." The brotherhood that conquered the impossible. The rescue of 300 soldiers from the sinking Liberty Bell became one of the most remarkable survival stories of World War II, but for Jack and Tommy McKenna, it was something more personal, proof that the bond between brothers could overcome any obstacle when the stakes were high enough. Jack spent 3 weeks in the Navy hospital recovering from hypothermia, pneumonia, and internal injuries from his underwater welding ordeal. His left shoulder never fully recovered from the dislocation, and he carried scars from the shrapnel wounds for the rest of his life. But he also carried the knowledge that his refusal to give up had saved 300 lives and brought his brother safely through the most dangerous mission of the war. Tommy continued to serve aboard the USS Franklin for the remainder of the war, participating in convoy escort duties and search and rescue operations throughout the Atlantic theater. He never forgot watching his brother disappear underwater again and again, risking his life to save soldiers he'd never met because failure meant letting everyone down. The soldiers who survived the Liberty Bell sinking never forgot the bleeding welder who had kept their ship afloat through 45 minutes of hell while his brother raced to reach them. Many of them maintained contact with Jack after the war, and several named their children after him in recognition of his sacrifice. Corporal Mike Santos, the young soldier from Brooklyn who had helped Jack carry welding equipment through the flooding compartments, became a successful shipyard owner after the war and hired Jack as his chief welding supervisor. "I owe you my life, Chief," Santos told Jack. "The least I can do is make sure you have a good job when this war is over." The technical innovation that Jack had achieved, performing emergency underwater welding repairs on a sinking ship under combat conditions, was studied by Navy engineers and became part of official damage control procedures for subsequent conflicts. His techniques saved countless lives in later naval operations and established new standards for emergency ship repair under extreme conditions. But for Jack McKenna, the most important recognition came from knowing that when everything had been on the line, when 300 lives had depended on his ability to attempt the impossible, he had found a way to succeed. He had proven that love for your brother and responsibility for your fellow service members could provide the motivation to achieve things that training and equipment alone could never accomplish. The legacy of desperate courage. Jack McKenna's underwater welding heroics aboard the Liberty Bell influenced military damage control procedures and rescue operations for decades after World War II. His demonstration that emergency repairs were possible under conditions previously considered hopeless led to improved training and equipment for naval damage control teams. The psychological impact of Jack's achievement was equally important. His refusal to accept that the situation was hopeless inspired a generation of military personnel to attempt rescue and repair operations under extreme conditions. The knowledge that one person with the right skills and sufficient motivation could save hundreds of lives became a cornerstone of military rescue doctrine. During the Cold War, Jack's techniques were adapted for nuclear submarine operations, where emergency welding repairs might be the difference between survival and disaster for entire crews operating far from surface support. The principles he had developed under combat necessity became standard training for submarine damage control specialists. After the war, Jack used his military experience and welding expertise to establish a successful marine repair business that specialized in emergency repairs for commercial shipping. His company pioneered underwater welding techniques for harbor construction, offshore oil platforms, and ship repair operations that incorporated the emergency procedures he had first developed to save his brother's rescue mission. Jack received the Navy Cross for his actions aboard the Liberty Bell, recognition that was unusual for enlisted personnel but reflected the life-saving impact of his innovations under impossible conditions. The citation specifically mentioned his willingness to risk his own life repeatedly to save fellow service members, and his demonstration that individual courage and technical skill could overcome seemingly hopeless situations. The relationship between Jack and Tommy McKenna after the war illustrated how shared extreme experiences could strengthen family bonds and create mutual understanding that lasted for decades. Tommy understood that Jack had risked everything to keep the Liberty Bell afloat until rescue arrived. Jack understood that Tommy had risked his own ship and crew to race through submarine-infested waters to reach them. The Liberty Bell rescue became a defining moment for both brothers, proving that their father's teachings about family loyalty and never giving up on people who were depending on you weren't just sentimental ideas but practical principles that could guide life and death decisions under the most challenging circumstances. The enduring power of brotherhood and sacrifice. The broader significance of Jack McKenna's story extends beyond naval engineering to fundamental questions about courage, family loyalty, and the relationship between personal motivation and extraordinary achievement under extreme stress. Jack had demonstrated that the most powerful technical innovations often emerged not from systematic research programs but from desperate necessity combined with relevant skills and overwhelming emotional motivation. His success was possible because he understood both the theoretical principles of underwater welding and the practical skills needed to adapt existing equipment under impossible conditions. The emotional motivation provided by his brother's rescue mission and the lives of 300 soldiers enabled Jack to take risks and attempt solutions that would have been rejected as suicidal under normal circumstances. The combination of technical competence and overwhelming personal stakes created conditions where conventional thinking gave way to creative problem-solving that achieved the impossible. Jack's approach required not just technical knowledge but also the physical courage to work underwater in conditions that would kill most people within minutes, and the moral courage to keep trying when every attempt seemed to fail. His willingness to risk his own life repeatedly was driven by the understanding that conventional approaches would result in mass casualties and his brother's arrival just in time to witness disaster. The principles Jack applied, adapting existing technologies to extreme conditions, persisting despite repeated failures, and accepting personal risk to protect others, proved relevant to many fields beyond military engineering. His story became a model for how individual initiative and self-sacrifice could achieve results that formal procedures and equipment had failed to accomplish. Perhaps most importantly, Jack McKenna had shown that the most extraordinary achievements often came from people who had personal stakes in solving problems that affected people they cared about. The love for his brother and responsibility for fellow service members provided the motivation to attempt things that pure professional competence might never consider. So here's the question Jack's story poses: what would you be willing to attempt if people you loved were depending on your success? How far beyond your normal capabilities could you reach if conventional approaches weren't sufficient to save lives that mattered to you? And what innovations might be possible if you combined your professional skills with the kind of desperate determination that makes failure unacceptable when family and community are on the line? Jack McKenna proved that sometimes the most sophisticated engineering is no match for a brother's love, the willingness to risk everything for people who are counting on you, and the refusal to accept that some situations are hopeless when giving up means watching everyone you're sworn to protect die in front of your eyes.